On my birthday, my nephew put down his fork, smirked, and said, "Uncle, your music sounds like a voicemail greeting from 1997." The table erupted in laughter, the kind that rolls over you before you can brace for impact. My sister shook her head like she was scolding him, but her smile didn't fade. My own son leaned back in his chair and added, "It's not his fault. He's just from a different era." And just like that, the air shifted. My birthday cake was still untouched, but I knew the celebration had already turned into something else entirely. A verdict, spoken and sealed. I was obsolete. I laughed too, because what else was there to do? The trick is to make the laugh sound real enough that no one notices the fracture forming behind your ribs. I sipped my wine, nodded as if I agreed with them, and let the room carry on. But inside, something cold and familiar settled in. The sensation of being pushed out of the circle, not violently, but with a gentle hand on your back that says, "You've had your turn. Step aside now." They didn't know what they were talking about, of course. They had never been in a studio at 2 in the morning when the song finally clicks into place. They had never watched a crowd fall silent at the first note of something you wrote alone in the dark. They had never felt the strange mix of terror and ecstasy that comes with sending a piece of yourself into the world, knowing it will either fly or vanish. To them, music was a playlist on shuffle, background noise to dinner or the drive to work. And I was the man still writing in a language they thought had gone extinct. Between bites and casual jabs, they kept circling back. "You should try TikTok," someone said. "Get a beat from one of those AI programs." Another chimed in, "Or just write something like that kid who blew up on YouTube. You know, catchy, short." I nodded, smiling, letting their words land and sink like stones into a deep pool. I didn't defend myself, not because I agreed, but because I knew defending myself would only prove their point in their eyes. Arguing is for people still trying to be understood. I had already been dismissed. Under the table, my hands stayed still, but in my head, the opening bars of a song I'd been carrying for years began to play. A melody so clear, so alive, that I could feel it in the spaces between their laughter. I had written it long before any of them had a driver's license, and it had been waiting, patient, unshaken, for the right moment to step into the light. So I let them talk. I let them laugh. I let the verdict stand. Because the best way to overturn a sentence like that is not to argue in the courtroom. It's to burn the entire courthouse down with the truth they never saw coming. Friends, let me pause here for just a moment. Write in the comments. Where are you listening to this story from? Has anything like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. That's how you help us grow this channel. And now, let's continue. That night, long after the laughter had faded into the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of a settling house, I found myself standing in the doorway of the music room. It wasn't really a music room anymore. Once it had been alive, cables coiled like sleeping snakes on the floor, a faint smell of wood polish from the guitar stands, the air dense with the memory of rehearsals that stretched past midnight. Now it was just another quiet space where dust gathered undisturbed. The piano sat in the corner, its black lacquer dulled, the surface layered with weeks, maybe months, of neglect. I stepped closer, dragging my fingertips across the lid. The dust clung to my skin, leaving faint streaks like evidence of absence. I opened it slowly, the soft groan of the hinges echoing in the stillness. The keys were exactly as I'd left them, some yellowed, some chipped at the edges, all waiting. I sat down without thinking. My hands hovered for a moment, unsure, then lowered. The first chord was brittle, the strings reluctant to remember, but the sound bloomed in the room all the same. I let my fingers drift, muscle memory carrying them to patterns I hadn't touched in years. Each note felt like both a reunion and a confession. I left you too long, but I'm here now. As I played, flashes came back. The sharp glare of stage lights blinding me as I hit the bridge, the way a crowd can inhale in unison when a lyric lands just right, the sticky floors of tiny bars where I played for tips and the promise of exposure. And then, the day the calls stopped. Not gradually, not fading out, but like someone had pulled the plug. The phone just went silent. No more gigs. No more "we'll be in touch." One morning I woke up and realized no one was waiting for my music anymore. I closed my eyes and kept playing until the melody found me again. That melody. The one I'd written in a burst years ago on a night when I'd felt both broken and unstoppable. It had followed me through everything. Through the lean years, the failed collaborations, the long stretches when I thought about selling my gear. I'd tried to leave it behind more than once, but it always came back, humming in the back of my mind like a heartbeat you can't unhear. I reached for the battered notebook on top of the piano, the one with frayed edges and pages curling at the corners. The paper was thin, almost translucent from years of being turned over. There it was, scrawled in pencil, the original chords, half-finished lyrics that I had promised myself I would fix later. I traced the lines with my thumb as if touching them might wake them up. In the quiet, I realized something. The song had been patient in a way I hadn't. It had waited for me to come back, waited for me to have the courage, or maybe the stubbornness, to try again. And now, with the echo of their laughter still fresh in my mind, I knew I had just been handed my reason. This wasn't just about proving them wrong. This was about breathing life into something they thought was dead, something they didn't even know had ever lived. And somewhere deep inside, I felt it. The first real spark in years, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that builds. In the days that followed, the spark I had felt at the piano grew into a steady, restless burn. I spent hours shaping the melody, sharpening the lyrics, until each line felt like it could cut through glass. The song was no longer just a fragment in an old notebook. It was a living, breathing thing demanding to be heard. And so I did what I had done years ago, what every musician with a finished song learns to do. I started knocking on doors. The first emails went out in a rush. I crafted them carefully, attached the demo, added just enough background to suggest experience without sounding like I was begging for the past to repeat itself. I watched my inbox like a gambler watching the wheel, hoping for that single reply that could change everything. Days went by, then weeks. The only responses were automated acknowledgments, polite but empty like machines nodding to a ghost. Most messages were swallowed whole, never even marked as read. I told myself it was just a matter of time, the right ear, the right mood, the right moment. But time kept moving without me. Finally, I decided to do it the old way, in person. I made a list of labels, big and small, printed copies of the song's sheet music, and burned a CD. Yes, a CD, for anyone who might still take one. The first meeting I managed to book wasn't with an executive, not even with a junior producer. It was with an A-Day NDR intern, barely older than my nephew, who greeted me with the distracted politeness of someone already late for something else. He listened to the opening verse through one earbud, tapping his phone with the other hand. Halfway through the chorus, he pulled the earbud out and said, "Yeah, it's nice, but it's not really what we're looking for, demographic-wise." He said demographic-wise the way you'd tell someone they were wearing the wrong color tie to a party. I nodded, thanked him for his time, and walked out into the city air. The building's glass doors closed behind me with a hiss, and I caught my reflection for a moment. Older, yes, but still here, still holding something worth hearing. I felt no shame in that moment, only clarity. Their gates were closed, but that didn't mean the song was dead. That night, I lay in bed with the chorus looping in my head, refusing to fade. It wasn't the words of the intern that kept me awake. It was the realization that I no longer cared about being invited in. I had wasted years waiting for permission, waiting for someone with a title to decide my voice still had a place. But the melody in my head didn't care about titles. It didn't care about demographics or market trends. It was alive, and it wanted out. I stared at the ceiling in the dark, and understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. If the doors won't open, you don't stand there knocking forever. You find another way in, or you build your own stage. And as the chorus repeated in my mind over and over, I knew that was exactly what I was going to do. The basement was never built for music. It was a place where the air stayed cool even in the summer, where a faint mustiness clung to the walls, and where the single bare bulb overhead cast a weak yellow light that barely touched the corners. For years it had been storage, boxes stacked on one another like old memories I didn't have the heart to throw away. But that night it became something else. If the so-called real studios wouldn't open their doors for me, then I would carve my own from whatever I had left. I started with the microphone. I'd found it months earlier in a thrift shop, buried in a bin of tangled cords and dented stands. The metal casing was scratched, and the pop filter had a tear along the edge, but when I tested it, the voice it captured was warm enough to believe in. I placed it on its stand, a rickety second-hand thing with a loose joint that made it sway if you looked at it wrong. I tightened every screw until it stood firm, willing it to hold steady, like a soldier keeping watch. Soundproofing was a laughable concept on my budget, so I improvised. I pulled every old blanket and quilt I could find from closets and boxes, hanging them over pipes, draping them across walls, tucking them into corners. The result wasn't pretty, but the space began to feel closer, softer, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Then came the problem of timekeeping. My old metronome had been lost somewhere between moves years ago, and buying a new one wasn't an option I cared for. So I built one out of mugs, 4 of them, each with a different level of water. I set them on the desk, tapping them with a pencil until I found a rhythm that matched the song's heartbeat. It was crude, almost childish, but the sound had an intimacy that no digital click could match. Upstairs, the refrigerator hummed with that low, constant note it had carried for years. At first I cursed it, thinking it would bleed into every take, but then I began to hear it differently. Not as interference, but as part of the environment. It became the bedrock under the melody, an unintentional bass line grounding every word I sang. I stopped trying to block it out. I let it stay. When I finally sat at the piano, the bench creaked under my weight, a sound that somehow felt like an old friend greeting me. I placed my hands on the keys and let the first verse slip out, tentative at first, then stronger. The microphone caught the rawness in my voice, not the kind of raw you get from neglect, but the kind you earn from carrying something unspoken for too long. Each phrase felt like a release, each note a small act of rebellion against the years of silence. I worked through the night. I played until my fingertips felt numb against the keys, until my throat burned from repeating the chorus again and again. I adjusted the blankets, shifted the mic, replayed the bridge until it landed exactly the way I'd heard it in my head for years. Coffee went cold in its mug without me noticing. The world outside slipped into darkness, then into the pale blue light of morning, unnoticed except for the way the bulb above me seemed dimmer in comparison. When I finally stopped, I just sat there, surrounded by cables, mismatched mugs, and the soft insulation of quilts on every wall. The demo wasn't polished. You could hear the fridge's low hum, the brush of my sleeve against the mic stand, the quiet tap of my foot keeping time. But it was real. It breathed. It carried the weight of the room and the truth of the moment. I saved the file under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, Untitled One. As I shut the laptop, I realized something. This space, cold, cramped, imperfect, had become more of a studio than any room with glass walls and expensive gear. It wasn't the equipment that mattered. It wasn't the approval of some gatekeeper in an office I'd never see again. It was the song, and the song was alive. He reached out late one night, the kind of hour when most messages are either emergencies or mistakes. The name that lit up my phone made me pause. A kid I'd once taken under my wing back when I still had a spot in the local scene. I remembered him then, nervous at open mics, clutching his guitar like it might slip away from him, asking questions so fast I could barely answer one before the next arrived. I'd shown him how to mic an amp, how to hold a note until it lived in the air just a moment longer than comfort. Then time had pulled us into different orbits. His message was short. Heard you've been working on something. Need a second set of ears? No credit. Just want to be there. There was no flattery in it, no attempt to sell himself, just a simple offer. I could have said no. Part of me wanted to keep the song mine alone for a little longer, to protect it the way you protect an ember in the wind. But another part, the part that remembered his stubbornness, said yes. He arrived the next afternoon with nothing but a backpack and an energy that filled the basement before he even set it down. His eyes roamed the makeshift studio, the thrift store mic, the blankets for soundproofing, the mugs on the desk, and instead of laughing, he nodded like he understood exactly why it was this way. That was the first sign I'd made the right choice. We started with the rough demo I'd made the night before. He didn't talk while it played, didn't fidget or check his phone. He just listened, leaning forward slightly, his head moving almost imperceptibly with the rhythm. When it ended, he said, "It's there, but it's wearing too many clothes." We went to work. We stripped the track down, piece by piece, removing anything that didn't feel essential. The layered harmonies I'd been so proud of. Gone. The extra piano flourishes that made me feel clever. Gone. We kept the bones. The chord progression that had carried me through sleepless nights. The pulse of the bass that matched a heartbeat. The vocal line that refused to let go once it was in your head. The more we removed, the more the song seemed to grow, like a photograph sharpening as the clutter fades. When we reached the bridge, I hesitated. It was the oldest part of the song, written in a haze of exhaustion and raw feeling years ago. I'd never changed it because I'd never been sure it could survive a second draft. He caught my pause, met my eyes, and said, "Play it, as it is." So I did. The first line came out tentative, almost shy. The second carried more weight. By the third, my voice had stopped thinking and started remembering. Every reason I had written those words, every night they'd been my only company. I didn't notice he'd stopped adjusting the levels until I looked up at the end and saw him sitting completely still, his hand resting on the mixer, his face unreadable. The silence stretched. Then he let out a slow breath, almost like he'd been holding it the whole time. "That's it," he said quietly. "Don't touch it." We didn't. We built the rest of the song around that bridge, careful not to let anything overshadow it. Hours slipped away in the dim light. Our only breaks, the moments we'd sit back and listen, not speaking, letting the music fill the space between us. By the time we stopped, the song was stripped to its essence. Nothing extra, nothing hidden, just bone and heartbeat. When he left that night, the room felt different. The blankets on the walls, the mugs on the desk, the hum of the refrigerator, all of it seemed to be holding its breath. The song was no longer just mine. It had been heard, understood, and shaped by someone who knew exactly how to handle it. And as I played it back alone, the bridge washed over me again, the same way it had washed over him, and I realized it had always been waiting for this moment. I'd learned enough from the years in this business to know that names can be both doorways and barricades. Mine, once a key that opened certain rooms, had long since become a lock others didn't want to pick. The industry had a way of remembering the wrong things. The one song that didn't chart, the album that didn't sell, the rumor that you'd stopped keeping up. If I released this song under my own name, it would come preloaded with every assumption they already had about me. It would be judged before the first chord. So I decided the song would have to stand alone. No baggage, no past, just a voice and a melody making their own case in the world. I spent hours choosing the alias, testing names until I found one that felt like a shadow of myself, close enough that I'd recognize it, far enough that no one else would. It wasn't clever or flashy. It was a name that could belong to anyone. And that was the point. There would be no photo attached, no cryptic coming soon posts, no hints about my history. The profile was as bare as a sheet of paper. The only thing on it, the title of the song and the length of the track. Even the credits were stripped back to the essentials. Words, music, production. The fewer clues, the better. I wanted the listener's ears to meet the song before their eyes met a name. When it was ready, I stared at the upload page for a long time. My hands hovered over the track like I could still pull it back, hide it away for another year. But the bridge echoed in my head, the one the young producer had told me not to touch, and I knew the song was ready to stand on its own legs. I clicked publish, the word lighting up in a shade of blue that felt colder than I expected. The screen blinked, loading, processing, confirming, and then it was out there, floating in the noise of millions of other voices, jostling for space, anonymous among the endless tide. I sat back and closed the laptop slowly, the way you might close a window in the middle of a storm, careful not to let the wind snatch it from your hands. It felt strange, not triumphant, not even anxious, but tender, like watching a child step outside into weather they've never known, hoping they'll find their footing before the ground gives way. The song didn't have my name to protect it. It didn't have my story to explain it. It would have to find its listeners the way all music should, by earning their attention, by making them stop what they were doing for 3 minutes and feel something they hadn't expected to feel. Upstairs, the refrigerator hummed. The mugs still sat in their odd formation on the desk, and the blankets on the walls sagged a little from the weight of the night's work. I lingered there in the dim basement light, not touching the laptop again, resisting the urge to refresh the page for plays or comments. I told myself I'd check tomorrow. Maybe. For now, it was enough to know the song was no longer trapped here with me. It had gone into the world nameless, faceless, free, and whether it sank or swam would be decided by strangers who didn't know the man who made it. That was the risk. That was the point. The first sign came quietly, like a match struck in another room. I wasn't even checking for it. I had managed somehow to keep my promise to myself not to obsess over numbers. But one evening, 2 days after the upload, a notification lit my phone. It was from a stranger, a night shift barista somewhere across the country. Her post was simple, a short video of her wiping down the coffee counter at 2 a.m., the song playing in the background. No caption about where it came from. No tags for clout, just her humming along under the flicker of fluorescent lights. Something about it caught. A handful of her followers commented asking, "What's this song?" And she didn't even know. Just said she'd found it by accident and couldn't stop listening. That alone would have been enough to make me sit up a little straighter. But the next morning, there was another ping, this time from half a world away. A dancer in Manila had taken the song's hook, looping it into the rhythm of her own choreography. The moves were sharp and fluid, but it was the way she timed her last spin to the drop into the bridge that made the comments blow up. Thousands of people asked for the track. Someone dropped the title. Streams ticked up slowly at first, like water rising in a glass. Then, a few days later, a busker in Lagos posted himself playing my chorus on an old guitar, singing it in a voice cracked with sun and wind. He'd translated the lyrics into his own language, reshaping the phrasing but keeping the melody intact. The comments poured in. Not about who wrote it, but about how it made them feel. That's when I realized the song was already leaving pieces of itself behind in other people's lives. From there, it spread without my hand on the wheel. Clips surfaced of street markets where vendors had it playing on small speakers. A girl in Sweden filmed herself driving through the night with the track on repeat, headlights reflecting off the wet asphalt in time with the beat. Someone in Brazil used it as the backdrop for a video about leaving their hometown. Each one sent a ripple through the streams. And my phone, once silent except for the occasional reminder or spam call, began to pulse with notifications, not all at once, not in a flood, but in a steady, rhythmic pattern. Ping, ping, ping. Like a metronome I hadn't set but couldn't ignore, every alert meant someone, somewhere, had chosen to listen. Every listen meant the song was alive in another corner of the world I'd never touched. I didn't tell anyone, not yet. I wanted to see how far it would go on its own legs, without the crutch of my name, without the scaffolding of my past. I kept working in the basement, tinkering with small things, but mostly I just let it breathe. And as the pings grew more frequent, as the streams began to chart a slow but steady climb, I started to feel something I hadn't in years. The quiet, unstoppable momentum of a song finding its way home to the people who needed it. It wasn't a wildfire yet, but the spark had caught, and sparks given enough air know exactly what to do. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those casual family gatherings where the TV was on low, snacks were scattered across the coffee table, and conversation drifted without direction. I had been sitting quietly in the corner, half listening, my phone in my pocket vibrating every so often with the now familiar pings. The song was still growing. More streams each day, more shares, more corners of the map lighting up. But here, in this living room, it didn't exist. At least not as mine. My nephew flopped into the armchair across from me, phone in hand, scrolling with the restless flick of someone chasing the next distraction. Then he laughed, shaking his head. Man, have you heard that new track everyone's spamming? Sounds like it was made by an AI or something. He played a snippet out loud, just long enough for the hook to escape the tiny speaker. My hook. The one I'd played in a basement at 3 a.m, the one I'd carried for years before letting it loose. The others chuckled, and someone muttered something about how music just isn't made the same anymore. My nephew added, "Yeah, it's catchy, but you can tell it's not real, no soul, just manufactured noise." He had no idea. None of them did. I could have said it right then. Could have leaned forward, looked him in the eye, and told him that the song he was dismissing as soulless was born from sleepless nights, from dusty piano keys and old blankets tacked to basement walls. I could have told him it had more of my soul in it than almost anything else I'd written. But instead I just smiled faintly and kept my hands in my pockets, letting the warmth of my palms press against my phone, the same phone that had just buzzed with another notification seconds ago. Friends who dropped by joined in, tossing around opinions they'd picked up from articles or comment threads. They talked about the death of craft, about how technology is replacing talent. Their voices layered over each other, confident in their detachment, unaware that the song they were dissecting had been built with nothing more high-tech than a thrift store mic, a piano with chipped keys, and a stubborn refusal to let it die. I stayed silent, not out of cowardice, but because I knew the truth didn't belong in that room yet. I wanted the song to reach them the same way it had reached everyone else, without bias, without the filter of my history. Let them think it was a trend, or a product of some faceless machine. Let them underestimate it, the way they had underestimated me. Every dismissal, every offhand comment, was just more kindling for the moment I would finally strike the match. The conversation moved on to something else, and I sat back, feeling the weight of the secret like a stone in my chest. Not a burden exactly, more like a seed. I knew it would grow in its own time, and when it finally broke through the surface, they'd see it for what it was. They'd see me for what I still was. The email came in the middle of the night, the kind of hour when the world feels thinner and every sound in the house is sharper. I was halfway through making tea when my phone lit up on the counter, the subject line reading simply, "Opportunity for collaboration." I opened it without thinking, expecting maybe a request for permission to use the song in a video, or a message from some small independent playlist curator. Instead, it was from a label, not one of the giants, but big enough that its name still carried weight. They said they'd recently discovered the track and had been impressed by its reach. They didn't mention my alias by accident. They had it in bold in the very first line, as if to remind me they didn't know or care who I was beyond the name on that upload. At first, the words were flattering. They called the song promising, the project marketable, the sound fresh. But as I read on, the shine dulled fast. Their proposal wasn't an invitation. It was a dismantling. They wanted to re-release the track under their banner with a 70/30th split, in their favor, of course. They offered professional guidance to maximize commercial potential. And buried halfway down the email, like it was nothing, was the real insult. They suggested bringing in a real writer to polish the lyrics. I stared at that line for a long time, the words swimming slightly on the screen. A real writer. I thought of the nights at the piano, the notebooks filled and abandoned, the hours shaping each phrase until it carried exactly the weight I meant it to. I thought of the bridge, the one I had sung in the basement while the young producer sat completely still, listening. A real writer hadn't been there then. I had. And every line in that song was mine. I could almost hear them in some conference room, talking about my song like it was a half-finished piece of furniture they could sand down and resell. To them, it wasn't alive. It was a product, something they could own, alter, package, and squeeze until there was nothing left but a hook they could license for commercials. My reply was short. I thanked them for their interest, for taking the time to listen, and then I declined, politely, firmly. I wished them the best in their search for the right fit. My fingers didn't hesitate over the keyboard, but when I hit send, the taste in my mouth was metallic, like biting down on a piece of foil. Afterward, I sat in the dim kitchen for a long while, the steam from my tea curling into the air and disappearing. Outside, the street was quiet, the kind of quiet that can make you feel invisible if you let it. But I didn't feel invisible. I felt anchored. Because saying no in that moment wasn't just about protecting the song, it was about protecting myself. They didn't know my name, but they knew my work. That was enough. And when the time came for the world to connect the two, it would be on my terms. Not in a press release where my role was reduced to original concept by. I'd spent too many years giving away pieces of myself for less than they were worth. This time I would hold the line. It started with a clip. Just 30 seconds of shaky phone footage from someone in the upper tiers of a stadium halfway across the world. The stage lights were blinding even from that distance, washing the performer in gold and shadow. I couldn't make out their face, but I didn't need to. What caught me, what stopped my breath, was the sound. 20,000 voices rising together, not just singing the hook, but locking into the bridge. My bridge, every word intact, every note exactly where I had put it all those years ago in the basement. They weren't guessing at the melody or mumbling half-remembered lines. They knew it like they'd grown up with it. I played the clip again, headphones on this time. The crowd's roar swelled at the start of the bridge, and then, as if on some silent cue, 20,000 throats dropped into the line I'd written on a night when the world had felt too heavy to keep going. And here it was, carried by strangers in a place I'd never been, echoing in a space built for giants. I had to pause halfway through just to sit with it. The sound was too big, too alive, for me to pretend it was anything less than real. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. People reposted it, captioning it with things like, "This song hits different live," or "This bridge will be the death of me." It stopped being about one performance and became a shared proof of something. That the song had moved past being just a track in someone's playlist. It was an anthem now, owned by everyone who sang it. Then the radio picked it up. Not just one station, but dozens. My phone lit up with notifications from cities I'd never stepped foot in. DJs were introducing it with my alias like it had always been there, like they'd been playing it for years. And with radio came the streaming surge. A spike so sharp it didn't climb the charts, it punched through them. Playlists that had once ignored my polite submissions were adding it without hesitation now, calling it essential listening. And then came the names. Names I remembered from the unanswered emails, from the industry doors that had stayed shut in my face, the executives who'd never returned my calls, the labels that had said my sound wasn't marketable anymore. My alias began appearing right above theirs on the charts, the numbers side by side like an unintentional scoreboard. It was petty to notice, maybe, but I did. I kept all of it to myself. The family didn't know. My friends didn't know. In the outside world, I was still the man with the outdated piano and the old notebooks. But in this other life, the one they couldn't see, the song was everywhere, in cafes in cities I'd never see, in the headphones of commuters on packed trains, in stadiums where the air vibrated with the sound of thousands singing something I'd written alone in the quiet. It felt like standing in a dark room watching a spark catch on dry wood, then on another piece, then another, until the glow was too wide to ignore. And I knew then that this was only the beginning. The fire was coming. It was the middle of the night, the kind of hour when the house feels like it's floating in its own silence. I woke without knowing why. No noise, no dream, just an inexplicable pull toward the faint glow on the nightstand. My phone screen lit the room in that cold bluish light, and there it was, waiting in my inbox. The subject line was only 4 words, but they were enough to change the air in my lungs. Platinum certification confirmed. For a long moment I didn't move. I just lay there, staring, the words refusing to settle into reality. I opened the email slowly, almost cautiously, like it might vanish if I looked too quickly. The body was short, formal, matter-of-fact, a link to the official documentation, a note of congratulations. Platinum. Not a dream, not a projection, not a rumor, a fact. 1 million copies sold and streamed in all the ways the industry counts these things. 1 million times someone had chosen my song, my bridge, my voice, without knowing my face or my history. The screen dimmed and I tapped it back to life, unwilling to let the moment fade. My chest felt tight, my heart thudding slow and heavy. I thought of the nights in the basement, the chipped piano keys under my fingers, the blankets on the walls sagging from their own weight. I thought of the mugs of cold coffee lined up like soldiers on the desk, the thrift store mic, the refrigerator hum that had accidentally become part of the recording. And I thought of the laughter at the dinner table, the casual dismissals, the assumption that whatever I had once been was gone. Eventually, I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cool under my feet. I didn't head straight to the kitchen. I took the long way through the house, past the shelves where my old CDs still sat in dusty stacks, past the photos from a time when music was my whole world and the idea of it ever fading felt impossible. The rooms were dark, quiet, holding their breath. In the kitchen, I set the kettle on the stove, the click of the ignition loud in the stillness. My hands were trembling as I reached for the coffee tin. Not from shock, exactly, but from something deeper, the awareness that I had carried this weight alone for so long, and now it was suddenly lighter. The sound of the water boiling seemed sharper, the smell of the coffee richer. Even the mug felt heavier in my grip, like it knew what it was witnessing. I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the cup, letting the steam rise into my face. The email was still open on my phone beside me, that single line of text glowing in the dim light. Platinum. No one in this house knew yet. No one in my family knew it was me at all, but the world, without realizing it, had already decided. And in that quiet, before dawn had the nerve to arrive, I allowed myself the smallest of smiles. Not the kind that comes with applause, but the kind that comes when you know the work, the struggle, the silence had all been worth it. It was mid-morning, the kind of lazy weekend where the light comes in slow and the world outside feels far away. I was still nursing my second cup of coffee when my phone buzzed on the table. Not the steady metronome of pings from streams and shares, but the sharper vibration of the family group chat. I glanced at the screen, expecting a picture of someone's dog or an argument about holiday plans. Instead, I saw my own song staring back at me. They'd sent a link, the official upload, the one under my alias, with a flurry of messages beneath it. My sister was first. This new artist finally gets it. You can feel it in every word. My nephew followed, the same one who'd once called my music a voicemail greeting, writing, "This is what real music sounds like. Whoever wrote this understands real life." Hearts and fire emojis lit up the thread, each one a spark of irony they couldn't see. I stared at the screen for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. There were so many things I could say. I could tell them the truth in a single sentence. I could drop the alias into the chat like a stone into still water and watch the ripples of recognition spread. I could remind them of the laughter, the comments, the moments when they decided I was done. But as my thumbs began to move, the words I typed felt wrong. Not because they were untrue, but because they would change everything too fast. There was something satisfying about their admiration existing in this pure, untainted way. No family loyalty influencing it, no obligation to be supportive. They loved the song because it had reached them as music, not as blood. And in some strange way, I didn't want to take that from it. So I erased the sentence, typed something vague instead. "Yeah, it's good." Then erased that too. In the end, I typed nothing at all. I let the conversation keep flowing without me, my name absent, my truth quiet. They kept talking, dissecting the lyrics, speculating about who this mysterious new artist might be. One of them joked about how they'd probably blow up overnight, how they'd be playing stadiums by next summer. I sipped my coffee, the corner of my mouth lifting in the kind of smile no one else could see because I already knew they were right. The thread pinged again and again, their excitement building. I set the phone face down on the table, letting their voices blur into the background like a distant radio. My song had reached them, not through shared history or family ties, but on its own merit. It had walked through the front door of their lives without me having to knock, and for now, that was enough. I chose a Sunday evening, the kind of night when the world outside is already folding itself into quiet and people are more inclined to linger. I sent out a message that was casual on the surface. "Come by if you're free. I want to play you something." No context, no explanation, just enough to spark curiosity. I could almost hear their puzzled voices in my head, wondering why I was suddenly asking them over. By the time they arrived, the house was lit low. I'd pulled the shades, turned off the overheads, and left only one lamp glowing in the corner. Its light pooled in a circle around the piano, the same one I'd been playing for decades, its keys worn smooth where my fingers had found them again and again. The rest of the room was in shadow, just outlines of chairs and framed photos, as if everything else had stepped back to make room for what was about to happen. They filed in, laughing softly, asking what this was about. I offered no real answer, only motioned for them to sit. There was a brief awkwardness, the kind you get when people feel they've stumbled into something they don't quite understand yet. The air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. I sat down at the piano and rested my hands on the keys, but didn't play right away. I looked at each of them in turn, my sister, my nephew, my son, the faces that had once smiled as they told me I was out of touch, the voices that had unknowingly mocked the song they were about to hear. I wasn't angry anymore. That was the strange part. The hurt had burned itself into something steadier, something closer to resolve. When I began, it was without introduction. No mention of aliases, no mention of charts or certifications, just the opening notes, bare and unpolished, exactly as they had sounded when I wrote them years ago in the stillness of a late night. My voice followed, not dressed up by production or layered harmonies, just me in the room, giving them the song as it was born. As the verses unfolded, I could feel the atmosphere shifting. The casual postures disappeared. They leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes fixed on me. The room grew smaller, more intimate, until it felt like the only thing that existed was the space between my voice and their ears. When I reached the bridge, I let it stretch out, holding the notes until they seemed to hang in the air longer than they should, the way they had when I first sang them into the thrift store mic. I didn't look at them until the last chord faded. And when I did, I saw no smirks, no glances exchanged over my head, just silence, the kind that has weight. I let it sit there. I didn't fill it with explanations or proof. The song was the proof. It always had been. For a moment, I thought about telling them then, about the alias, the streaming numbers, the stadiums singing along. But something in me resisted. Not yet. Tonight was about reclaiming the room, about reminding them who I was without needing to list the receipts. They had heard the song, they had felt it. That was enough for now. The final chord was still trembling in the air when I let my hands fall into my lap. The room was steeped in a silence so complete, it almost felt alive, like the song itself had taken a seat among us and refused to leave. I didn't speak right away. I let them sit with it, let the weight of what they had just heard sink into whatever space their laughter had once occupied. Then, without a word, I reached into my pocket and took out my phone. It was the same old phone they'd mocked before, its edges worn, the screen spidered with hairline cracks that caught the lamplight. I unlocked it, my fingers steady now, and opened the app I'd been checking in secret for months, the portal, my portal. I turned the screen toward them. The glow lit their faces unevenly, catching the widening of their eyes, the flicker of recognition they couldn't quite name yet. There, in bold letters at the top, was the alias they'd been praising in the group chat. Just below it, the title of the song they'd sent to each other, dissected, celebrated. The same one they'd just heard raw from my own hands. Next to it, a digital badge, platinum certification. Beneath that, the numbers, streams in the millions, royalties in figures they'd never imagined were tied to my name. No one moved. My nephew leaned forward slightly. as if getting closer might somehow make the numbers less impossible. My sister's hand hovered near her mouth, fingers pressing lightly against her lips. My son, who had been leaning back in his chair moments ago, now sat upright, eyes locked on the screen, his jaw working but no words coming out. I didn't explain. I didn't trace the path from basement to stadium, from rejection emails to this page. I didn't remind them of their jokes or their certainty that I was out of touch. I just let the truth sit there between us, glowing softly in the dim light. It didn't need defending. It didn't need selling. It simply was. The silence wasn't the brittle kind that comes with shock or guilt. It was heavier, warmer, the kind that builds a bridge back over a gap you thought had grown too wide to cross, the kind that doesn't erase what was said before, but begins to answer it. No applause, no hurried congratulations, just that rare, fragile stillness where the past and the present finally meet without fighting. I set the phone down on the closed lid of the piano and leaned back in my seat. They were still staring, but their eyes were different now, not trying to measure me against the man they thought they knew, but seeing me as I was, here, in this moment. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything at all. I let the phone rest on the piano lid for a moment longer, its quiet glow painting the room in pale light. They were still looking at me, as if waiting for me to hand them a script for what came next. Instead, I gave them only a sentence, slow and steady, my voice low enough that they had to lean in to catch it. Out of touch, I said, is what they call you right before you touch them. The words settled over us, not sharp like a rebuke, but sure, like a truth that had been waiting its turn. No one argued. No one smiled. They simply absorbed it, the way you absorb a song you didn't know you needed to hear. In the days that followed, I thought maybe that moment was the full circle, that the quiet recognition in their eyes was the only vindication I would need. But then the invitation arrived. Heavy cardstock, my name, my real name, embossed across the front. An industry event, an award ceremony. I knew exactly what it was about, though they never mentioned the song in the invitation. They didn't have to. When the night came, I stood backstage in a jacket I hadn't worn in years, the hum of the crowd muffled through the curtain. I'd spent most of my career on the other side of moments like this, watching others walk the stage, their names carried on applause. Now, waiting for mine, I realized I wasn't nervous, not because I didn't care, but because I knew the work had already spoken louder than any speech I could give. And then they read it. Not the alias, not the mask I'd worn to let the song grow without prejudice. My own name, the one I'd been born with, the one they'd stopped associating with music a long time ago. The room erupted, flashes from cameras blooming like stars across the audience. I walked to the podium, the weight of the years pressed into my steps, and took the small, heavy plaque they handed me. I didn't give them the whole story. I didn't have to. I just thanked the people who had listened, truly listened, and stepped back. Later, when I came home, the house was dark, except for the single lamp I'd left on in the corner, the same lamp that had lit the piano the night I played them the song. I set the plaque down on a side table, barely glancing at it before turning toward the instrument. My hands found the keys without thinking, the familiar smoothness meeting me like an old friend. They were warm, as if they'd been waiting. I played a chord, and the sound rolled through the room, fuller somehow, not because the piano had changed, but because I had. The future felt louder now, not in the sense of fame or recognition, but in the quiet certainty that I wasn't done, that there were still melodies in me that no one had heard yet. And as I sat there, letting the notes drift into the empty house, I realized the sweetest part of justice wasn't the applause or the plaque, or even hearing my name from the stage. It was knowing that the people who once believed I'd lost my touch would never forget the moment they learned I hadn't.